Good afternoon. I'm Syed Khalil. I'm the Guyana Chronicle. It has been said repeatedly that Guyana is not standing behind the entire debt profile of the project. We hear that the debt financing component of the project will be 70%. Some of that coming from the IDB, the CDB, and other sources. Who is primarily responsible for paying back that debt? I want to add a caveat. I understand that there are some legal semantics as it relates to the special project vehicle and the state. However, we need to note that the taxpayers' participation is roughly, when I calculated it, 82%. That is by way of the debt as well as the equity participation in the entire special project vehicle is 82%. So, to the original question, who will be responsible for paying back the debt of the project?
Right, we seem to have 2 or 3 questions. So what we do is we take the first one, we'll answer that, then I'll ask you to repeat the second and third, and we will answer that. Winston, would you like to go first on this? Or anyone of your team? Thank you.
Good?
Actually, that'd be a lot easier too. You gotta just sit down and answer the question.
I put this slide because I think it's helpful to show the flow of how the contract structure works. The simple answer to your question is AFHI in the middle there. It's their debt. It's raised on their balance sheet. It's guaranteed by nobody but them. What is guaranteed by the government is GPL's performance. So if you see the first block here, you see electricity going to GPL and tariff going to AFHI. So the simplest way to think about this is that so long as GPL performs, so long as GPL pays the tariff, the guarantee is irrelevant. Only if GPL doesn't perform. And the reason it's set up that way is GPL is effectively a subsidiary of the government. It's 100% owned, 100% controlled, 100% financed at this point by the government. In that case, to raise the debt at the Amaila Falls Hydro Inc. level, the lenders need to be certain that GPL is going to perform.
Just a moment. Some people have mics open. When you ask a question, shut it off because we're getting feedback. Sorry, go ahead.
So just to wrap up the answer. So long as GOG and GPL perform, there's no guarantee obligation. That is why I believe it is entirely incorrect to characterize the capital structure as 82% Guyana government. I would say, I think this slide here really shows you, unfortunately it's a little small on the screen, but you can see that 70% of the capital is debt. As long as GPL performs, government of Guyana has no obligation with respect to that debt. The government's $100 million gets them 39% of the total equity. So site puts in $158 million approximately, the government puts in 100. That comes out to be about 60-40, which is simply based on the economic split.
Are you okay on that one? You want to follow up on that particular question? Press the button.
Right. That is why I added my caveat. Again, I'm saying that the semantics of it is that the state is separate from AFHI. But for all practical intents and purposes, the IDB debt and the CDB debt, who will be footing it? Isn't it the Guyana taxpayer who will be footing it? I heard you quite loud and clearly the first time when it's being said that the government is only guaranteeing GPL's performance. But for all practical intents and purposes, the entire debt accrues to the Guyana taxpayer, regardless of what AFHI is registered as or who the IDB is lending to. It all boils down to the Guyana taxpayer. That is what I'm trying to establish. Who is responsible for the debt ultimately?
Okay, I'll ask Winston to Brassington and his team to answer that. And then you can come back in if you want.
The source of money to repay the debt is the payment for the electricity. So if you're looking for where the money is ultimately coming from, it's the ratepayer. The ratepayer pays GPL, GPL pays Amaila Falls Hydro. That is the source of the cash flow that's used to repay the debt. I think that's the simplest way to think about it. There's no taxpayer involved in here, so long as GPL collects money from its customers and pays the relevant amount to Amaila Falls Hydro. It is not there's no smoke and mirrors. It's a very simple structure. AFHI sells electricity to GPL, who sells electricity to its customers. Customers pay GPL, GPL pays AFHI, AFHI pays its lenders.
And just another point on that. AFHI is the borrower. The government of Guyana is not a borrower. So just like when you go out and you get a mortgage for your house, and that mortgage is between you and the bank. In this instance, AFHI, or Amaila Falls Project, is the borrower entering into an agreement with CDB and IDB. So at the end of the day, it is the project's obligation. And just one final point, it is very important to point out, there are no payments to the project other than the tariff, which, as Brian and as I highlighted, those tariff, we pay for the debt and the equity returns on this project with savings that begin at 40% for the consumer, then grow to 70%, then grow to 91%. So all of the payments to support all of that debt and all of that equity are embedded within that massively cheaper power.
Thank you. It would help, I think, if Winston and his team repeat and explain how AFHI is actually made up. What is it?
AFHI is a private company. So, although government has a minority share in AFHI, it is a private company. The debt that is being borne by AFHI does not show up on the debt of the government. It doesn't show up on a debt of government. The company that is contracting to repay that debt is Amaila Falls Hydro Inc. If that company goes bankrupt before the project is finished, the government doesn't have any obligations because the project, GPL has not begun receiving power and therefore has no obligation to pay. So this is why we make a big deal about the difference between a performance guarantee and an outright guarantee of the debt. We are only standing behind GPL's obligation. And GPL's obligation is pretty much to pay the annual tariff. And that money is used to repay the debt and the return to the equity investors. So we don't have that debt in the government books. The government is only at risk if GPL doesn't pay what it's supposed to pay. And, well, let me end there.
All right, just a final question now.
So we covered one, we covered the caveat. What's next? What's next? Go ahead. I'm
So the final
moderating this
clarification
meeting.
is the government will never bail out AFHI. That's what we're trying to establish here.
Let me speak to the worst case situation. Let us suppose the government calls for currency movement or nationalize the project and said to GPL, you not to pay any more money to this project. Right? Under the contract, that will be categorized as political force majeure. Right? And under the contract, the non-payment will result in termination and an obligation of government to buy out the project. In that worst case situation, we would be obligated in exchange for buying out the project right, which will include the debt. But we get the asset, we'll be obligated to pay the debt. But this would be a direct cause by the government, because its actions is what precipitated the default by GPL. So the contracts that we have speak to every single contingency that you can think of in these types of projects. And that is why the quantum in the motion is so high, because it really looks at the worst case, right? But in the normal course of business, once we pay that tariff, the guarantee really wouldn't trigger.
I'm going to try to make it really simple for everybody in the room. There are two circumstances. One, where there is a default by the project. The other column, if you want to just draw a line down the middle of your page, default by the project. On the other side of the page, default by the government. Default by the project. There is no bailout under any circumstances. None. If there's on the other side of the page, if there's a default by the government, yes, GPL is owned 100% and controlled by the government. So if the government decides not to pay GPL's bills and decides not to pay the project, yes, there is an obligation for the government, and that's where, if you want to use the word bailout, that's where the bailout would occur. But the bailout is solely in control of the government. As long as the government, via GPL, does exactly what it said it would do, which was just simply pay for this very cheap power, then there is no implication of the guarantee. If the government decides hypothetically to expropriate the asset or just not to pay via GPL, then there is a liability for the government. That's the only circumstance where there is a quote-unquote bailout.
Thank you. Hopefully we've exhausted that one with the lady next to Chris Wren.
Thank you, Kit. My name is Janet Walkan. Hi, Chris.
Now I recognize you. All right.
So I learned from Brian and Speaker Sean, as you both said, you came here today hoping to get consensus, national consensus, and parliamentary consensus for a project of this magnitude. We have seen in the press in Guyana and from government ministers and spokespeople a wide variety of numbers and figures and projections and disputes. So this room we're sitting in is not the National Assembly. And in democracies, what would be the norm in your country as well would be a green paper in large projects which would set out the pros and cons in plain English and with supplementary documents, with all the documents that go to the National Assembly, but then go to parliamentary subcommittees and to public stakeholder consultations. You mentioned as well that you're looking for financial closure by the end of the year. So it seems to me, as we are now at the end of July, so there is time for you to bring you and the private owners of the private, what did you say? The private company that makes up AFHI, Amaila Falls, to bring such a green paper to the National Assembly. And so I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Do you want to answer that?
I was just going to say that we would be happy to provide whatever information we can. We'd be happy to help put together a document. I don't think it is our position.
I think, Jan, it would be much fairer to direct that question to the government side, not to them.
Let's put it this way. We'd be
Well,
happy
I'd
to
be
support.
glad if the government
And that's what I'm going to do now.
Okay. I recall that last January, Site Global, this is January of 2012, Site Global came to Guyana and they met with key stakeholders, including the opposition, including the private sector, including the media, and they made presentations on the project. The government has also engaged the opposition in dialogue on this project. Because the project is still being developed, We did that behind closed doors. We started last March of 2012. We had a 3 to 4 hour presentation to the AFC and afternoon. We took them through every aspect of the project. We said, if you have questions, let us know and we'll respond. We didn't get any questions back. This year again, we sat down with them in March of this year. We updated them on where things were. And then in June, after having not received any requests, comments, or questions, we gave them the 3 major agreements that we initialed for the project: the power purchase agreement, the receivables agreement, and the implementation agreement. In addition to that, they had an opportunity to meet with the IDB. We arranged that meeting. The Caribbean Country Director also came into Guyana to meet with the opposition and to brief them on the IDB's perspective. They had a chance to visit the road. So I would say that we've had dialogue with the opposition for the last 18 months to try to impart to them all of the information that they would need in order to properly assess this project. We didn't take it in Parliament because, given the way the transaction is developing, and I want to say that the opposition, true to their word, kept that information confidential. It's only recently I've seen some of it in the media. But during this entire 18-month period, what we give them, the copies of our presentations, they kept confidential. Because a lot of the details of this transaction, we could say what we know now, but we could say also that we don't know if this is final. And there's danger when all of that is basically being published, as if it's done and delivered. So, the substitute to your green paper would be what we did, would be to share information of a comprehensive nature with the opposition, to provide them the opportunity to request more information, to ask questions, and to respond to that. But let me say that right now, we're going to share our presentations today, and in dialogue with SITE, SITE is committed to us making as much of this information publicly available. But this is not something that we can say is now being made available. Our position would be that much of this information we have shared with the opposition or sought to make available as much as they wanted to have.
With all due respect, it seems to me that...
Janet, please. What? We're not here for political debate. And I would like other people to get an opportunity. I'll let you have the floor later. But not a political debate, please. Over there.
Glenn, how good, how much experience, how equipped Blackstone and Site Global is, none of my business. How much money Mr. Brasington, China Development Bank has is none of my business too. My concern is the cost of this project. Because at the end of the day, my children, our children and grandchildren will have to repay this debt. The Skeldon plant, the government spent almost $200 million.
Glenn, I would ask you to address your questions to the project. I'm not going to allow too much strain.
This project is almost costing 5, if not more time than that of the Skeldon plant.
That's mental crazy.
From the beginning of this project, I believe it was prepared in secrecy and designed to mislead and wrong us. That I firmly believe.
Glenn, please, Glenn, I would ask you, Glenn, that let's keep this. You're a professional journalist, you own a newspaper, behave like one.
Explain how fit was a license to develop the hydropower in the first place. Explain why this license was repeatedly extended when he failed to honor the 2006 MOU with GPL and Sam Hines.
Good
and
question.
of course, everybody remember, Sam Hines could not recall signing until he was shown his own signature. I emphasize that this project was prepared in secrecy, Mr. Chairman,
You don't expect an answer to that, do you?
No.
Good. Then let's carry on.
And designed to rob us, because it's clearly.
You expect an answer to that? Glenn, I have a duty and responsibility here. I am not going to allow you or anyone else to start making wild accusations.
The handling of the access road.
Good. Let's get to it.
I don't think some people in this audience really remember how Mr. Brazelton and when Mr. Brazelton placed an ad in the newspapers for that project. That ad was placed on the 15th of December to the 17th of January. Now, Mr. Chairman, let Mr. Brazelton tell us how he can find a contractor. Which contractor can go into that bush from the 17th of December to the 15th of January and come up with a proper proposal?
All right.
Guess what happened?
Can we get an answer to that? I'm not taking off the floor. Let's get an answer to that.
Okay.
Winston.
We got an
Turn your button up.
The access road was publicly advertised. We got 4 bids. Parties were allowed the opportunity to visit the site before they put in the bid. The bids were evaluated by a group out of Public Works. I'm not too clear on the suggestion that the time that we had the advertisement open was short. It was for more than 6 weeks. I believe your newspaper had a number of articles during that period highlighting that we've advertised the access roads. So it was a public bid, open to all, not done in any secrecy. It was highlighted so we can get as many people to come in. We were working then with tight timelines. That we wanted to see the project finished within 8 months. We're a couple of years late. But everything we did was in good faith, and everything we did was open.
You really expect me to believe everything was done in good faith, Mr. Brazelton?
You're free.
15th of December to the 17th of January, you advertised that project. And guess what? Fit Motilal got it. I have shown very clear to this entire nation that Fit didn't even have an office in the US. I have shown to this nation that Fit came and worked out of a garage and was given a $15.4 million US contract when a man didn't even know how to put a pavement.
Glenn, you're turning this into a political fiasco. You asked a question, you got an answer. What's the next question?
Explain how Fit got a hydropower license.
Fine.
I asked that question.
Fine.
I asked
We will address that.
why it was repeated.
Glenn, we will address that next. The license.
All right. Now, the license was issued first to Synergy Holdings. I believe it would be over 13 years ago. It has been renewed a number of times. At that time, any prospective developer who wanted to develop hydro would approach the government and say, I want to do a project. That developer would take the risk and their own money and do the feasibility study. This is exactly what FIP did. The government didn't pay for his feasibility study. He took a great risk preparing the feasibility study back then for this project. But you can do all the feasibility studies in the world. You don't have a project unless you have an off-taker, someone who would buy the output, in this case the power from the project. GPL at that time had just been privatized. The private management didn't consider that it had sufficient demand then to contemplate the project. The project languished. When, a few years after, the management decided to take a look back at it, demand was growing, we started to discuss it. A few years after that, Site Global came on board. But let us recognize that during this period of development, all of the risks are being borne by our private party. Site Global has mentioned they've spent 16 million. China Rail is spending money. We have no obligations to pay them back. If basically the project is not realized.
Mr. President, we are talking about FIP.
Any other questions?
FIP.
Well, I'm talking of the license that was issued to FIP, and when FIP realized, having spent the money and so on, that he needed a partner to basically work with him, that is how SITE got involved. And basically, SITE took over as the developer of the project, and SITE agreed that FIP and what he spent will be compensated when the project reaches financial close.
What money FIP spent? FIP had nothing, my friend. Nothing. You got my money, the taxpayers' money, and loaned it to FIP to even purchase the equipment that he brought in.
I simply am not going to statement. It's not true. Over there.
Gary, yes. If we could start with a few clarifications first. Mr. Sean Timza from Blackstone, you mentioned that there would be no incremental repayments for SITE. Mr. Quebec last year spoke of incremental payments. Mr. Brassington a few minutes ago spoke of the payments being between 110 million to 120 million in the first 13 years. So if we could get some clarification on that one.
We'll take it one by one. Come back to it. Did you get the
I'm
question?
not positive I understand the question.
Okay, go over it again, please.
Let me maybe try.
All right, let me repeat. Mr. Timzak said a few minutes ago that there will be no incremental repayments. Last year when you were here, you spoke of incremental repayments. Mr. Brassington a few minutes ago spoke of between 110 to 120 million in the first 13 years.
The payments, I think there's a confusion on what we mean by payments. So GPL pays the project company, of which we own 60%. A payment. That's in the 110 to 120. After the project company pays its operating expenses, after the project company pays its debt service, it has residual cash flow. That is how that residual cash flow then is a dividend that comes to us. That is how we recover the money we put in plus return.
And put it differently, if we were to go back to page 15 of the presentation, and as was mentioned, we'll make this available to everybody so you can see the exact numbers. The average tariff from years 1 to 12 is $122 million. That's it. That's what's paid for the project. That $122 million that is paid for the project, which I will add in the first 12 years is of course 40% less than the country is paying today. That $122 million goes to pay for the repayment of the debt, all of the payments to the equity, and the operating costs. So think about that as a lump sum price.
I think you had another question?
Yes, quite a few.
Carry on.
Last week at the stakeholder forum, all of the main speakers, President, Prime Minister, Minister of Housing and Water, spoke of the price being $840 million for the project. Mr. Brassington is saying now $858 million.
Right.
Could we say why the mix-up in just a few days, or why is it wasn't reported at $858 last week? Last week also we were told that the tariff would be reduced by 40%. We're being told now that the tariff would be reduced by 20%. It's the cost of production that would be reduced by 40%. A clarification on that one.
All right, we'll take that one. Let's take it one by one. Would you like to take that, Winston?
I could take it.
Oh, you would take it? Fine.
Periodically, we update all of the numbers. So the biggest change of that 18 million was foreign exchange depreciation. Part of it. Unfortunately, I think last week's number was a little bit out of date. But when you update everything as of today for a meeting like this, using current rates, using current information.
That's why we have the technical people in this room.
You have a big chunk of that was foreign exchange. Part of it was additional money that's required to satisfy IDB's environmental and social requirements on the project. And part of it has to do with just the extension of time. As the project takes longer, we continue to spend money. IDB continues to spend money. That's the big challenge. The longer this takes, the more it's going to cost. Every month extra that it costs, that we take, the project cost will go up. It's going to happen every month until we close the project. And then it stops. Once you close the project, that's it. There's no more FX, there's no more development costs, there's no more nothing. Project cost stops.
Let me ask a question on that. At what time, at what point does the price get locked in?
As soon as we hit financial close. So when I described before the October 30 IDB board date, we get that on October 30. There's some conditions we think will take us a couple of months to satisfy, the access road probably being the biggest one. As soon as that happens, we've cleared the conditions. IDB funds, we give notice to proceed under the EPC contract. The EPC contract price is locked for good. As I said, no more FX, no more nothing.
Could you say of the 175 million US that Site Global is putting as equity, how much would be in terms of cash and how much in terms of services?
The number is 157 and it's all cash.
100% of our capital that will be contributed will be in cash.
I'm glad you raised that question.
Mr. Brassington, you spoke of...
On the other question, I think the guy son would like to add something. Yes?
I think indeed there's been different statements made on the level of reduction of costs and the level of reduction of tariffs. I think sometimes it's referred to as if they're the same, but you have to make that distinction of what is cost and what is tariff. I think the general numbers are that the cost is, we're looking at that coming down by close to 40%. And the tariffs will come down by 20%. As you progress through time, your cost is constantly changing. So a year from now, fuel prices could be higher and that reduction could be, of cost could be higher. So when we speak of costs, we're speaking of what we've actually spent compared to a recent period. And it could change over time. Because the tariff hasn't been changing, it's a little easier to look at that. You have to still maintain your spare parts. And you'll have to bring it up periodically to basically keep it in test. But because you don't have the running hours, you're not going to incur much in terms of replacement of parts, because parts are largely based on how many running hours you've used it. You will have to have a standby crew, but many of these plants today are extremely automated. Right? The Wärtsilä plant has full controls. You go into the control room, you only have 2 people, maybe 1. So you will have a skeleton crew that you will have. So in dollars and cents, I can come back to you, but I would reckon the cost will be less than half of a cent per kilowatt based on GPL. So it will be fairly minimal.
When Amaila comes on stream during this period, could you say, you make mention of the skeleton crew, how much employees would GPL have to let go? And if I may quickly, you speak of the 70 gigawatts that Linden would demand and bringing them on stream. The last time government tried to bring Linden on stream, we had a month-long shutdown, 3 people shot dead. Could you say what are the plans to go about bringing Linden on stream? And you speak of bringing the 600 self-generators on stream. There is all this talk of assuming that they will come on stream. What, if any, guarantee is there that any of these self-generators, including the larger ones, the banks, DIH, DDL, the others, that they would come on stream?
Okay, there are three questions. I think, first of all, the employment, then Linden, then the self-generators.
Today, over 75%, almost 80% of GPL's power is generated outside of GPL. Woodsilla and Gaisuko accounts for close to 80% of our total generation. So the employees do not belong to GPL. Employees belong to Gaisuko or to Woodsilla. When the power plant comes in line, they'll have to make adjustments. Now, for GPL staff, we will over time need to review what we have. But recognize that today, and increasingly, as we outsource more of our generation, GPL is less a generation company today than it was 4 years ago. In respect of Linden, bringing Linden onto the grid is because a substation will be built in Linden and the power from Amaila will come through Linden and will be much cheaper than what they're paying using the diesel generators up there. And we're not speaking here of tariffs.
So, let me interrupt you. Are you saying the cost to Linden consumers would come down?
Well, right now, the cost will come down. Let me say that cost today is highly subsidized. The Lindeners pay less than 10% what GPL pays. But that cost will come down from a generation cost of close to 30 US cents a kilowatt hour. That cost will come down to close to 10, 11 cents. Now the cost is largely paid by the government as a subsidy, and this is a separate issue from the tariffs that are paid by the consumers. So Linden being connected will simply reduce the level of subsidy in the first instance the government is paying, and one can treat the tariff issue in Linden as a separate issue. In terms of self-generators, recently Banks DIH, which is probably one of the most efficient self-generators, disclosed that their generation cost using heavy fuel oil, Hyundai generators, is at least 24 cents per kilowatt hour. Most companies use diesel generators, and their cost is probably at generation point in excess of 30 US cents. The large diesel generators, when you measure everything, the large diesel generators is probably above 30 US cents a kilowatt hour. With the expected tariff that we're looking at from Amaila being more in the vicinity of 24 US cents, we expect that will be an incentive for them to come on to the grid. But in addition to that, when Amaila comes in stream, all of the tax incentives for fuel and spare parts and generators, for thermal generators, those exemptions will expire, will go away. So we're incentivizing self-generators to come onto the grid. But the primary driver will be cost. That the cost of GPL end user tariffs will be competitive, will be cheaper than their ability to self-generate using their own engines.
If I could come back to AFHI. It is
separate use. Kaicho, sorry. How many more questions do you have? Because you're
you said you wouldn't want us to go away without questions.
No, I don't. I'm not silent thinking. I was just wondering if we could come back.
Last one for now.
Right. Glenn, I'm chairing this meeting, not you.
AFHI. The shareholders would be Site Global 60%, government 10%. I'm wondering who negotiated the loans from China? How did you come up with the 8.5% return rate? The Site Global equity, could you justify that 19% return?
Sure. To the first question, the shareholders of AFHI, so that's both SITE and the government, participated in all of the negotiations with China Development Bank as well as with Inter-American Development Bank. So those rates, in fact, have come down, the margins from the banks. The government site together, again, AFHI is owned 60% by site, or will be owned 60% by site, 40% by the government. So both parties have a right to be at the table during the negotiation of those loans. Coming back to the question of site's return, site is involved in hydro projects and other power projects all over the world. For a project of this nature, with risks of this nature, I would actually characterize the risk allocation here in exchange for the return as something less than what we've seen in other similar projects. That is involved in Africa, other places in South America, in Asia. We've done a lot of work, and I would characterize with a similar situation, this is better than your typical competitive return.
If I may, Blackstone has been involved in a lot of projects. Technically, Site Global has only completed one project, hydropower project. That would be the Ugandan project.
Yeah, maybe some history of Site Global is in order here. Site Energies was started in the early 1980s and built many hydros, most of them smaller early on. I mentioned before, when I worked for Site Energies and I was based in the Philippines, we finished a 350 megawatt project there. So there were about a dozen smaller hydros, then the 350 megawatt project, which at the time was the largest infrastructure project that was privately financed in Asia. In the early 2000s, there was a change of ownership in Site Energy. So all the same people. Jim McGowan was there, I was there, the CEO of Site Global was there, all part of that Site Energies team. A change of ownership that ultimately ended up in Blackstone owning 99% of it. But the same team, the same people, the same guys who oversaw construction of the Philippines plant, oversaw construction of the Uganda plant, and will oversee construction of this plant.
So put very simply, the site team that is represented here today has done 80 projects. The yield and the return on this project would be commensurate with the returns and the risks on those prior projects. As to your question about Blackstone and how we think about projects like this relative to other projects, I can't get into the confidential rates of return with specific projects, but what I can tell you is that this rate of return for this project is at the absolute low end of something that we would consider for the risk. We have been spending 6 years of our time, $16 million on the project. We're taking construction risks and we're taking operating risks on the project. All of those risks, when you put them together, are substantial. And when we think about projects like this, there's a reason why there isn't a line of people out the door here today looking to do projects like this, because these are, all in, we will have spent over a decade trying to develop this project. I'll be very clear, and I don't want to stray from the question, but we are very happy if the Guyanan government wants to support this project. We are very happy to partner with the government to do this project. If the Guyanan government and the people of Guyana decide that this is not a project that they want to support, and if you don't want 40%, 70%, and 91% cheaper power, we're glad to go away. We're here only today to try to build consensus, increase transparency, and share information. I hear all of the concerns that were raised before. I can tell you a firm like Blackstone and firms like Scythe, where we're the largest investment manager in the world, we don't come to Guyana to play games. We're simply here to actually try to make a difference. So I really hope that everyone who is approaching this with a very skeptical eye, especially when it comes to rates of return and things of the like, who appreciate that this is the basis on which we're willing to do this deal. If the government and the people of Guyana decide that this is not what you want, we're glad to go away.
I think the lady in green. You. Yes.
Yeah. Mr. Brassington. I'm Kiranan. Kaiju News. Kiranan, Kaiju News.
It seems the Kaito News are the only newspapers there. Are there any other journalists there who wish to ask a question? Nope. Okay, I'll take you. I think
Mr. Brassington, I
come
want to
to
take you back to Fifth Motilal and the licensing. You made mention earlier that the government was approached and the go-ahead was given. But any due diligence was run in Fifth to see if they actually do this?
Good question.
Let me say that the licenses issued pursuant to the Hydroelectric Act are handled by the Office of the Prime Minister. What I can say is that every case is looked at, and the yardstick that is generally used is that before you can develop a project, you've got to spend millions of US dollars to do the feasibility study. And all of this money is at risk. All of it. So if you have the money to spend to do the feasibility study, and Site Global and Synergy hired an international firm with a lot of experience in doing feasibility in hydros, MWH, Montgomery Ward Hydro, to do that feasibility study. So the acid test is, will that developer take the risk and spend the money? And in this case, 50.
That's not the question she asked. What study you did?
Are you on the floor, Glenn, or?
I'm saying that at any...
Glenn, you will address questions through me, or I will not allow you to ask a single question more. Now address them through me. Your report is on the floor.
Let me finish. The bottom line is, we are dealing with Blackstone today, one of the largest private equity funds in the world, with over 200 billion of assets, because of the work done by FIP. This is the nature of development of these projects. Someone will come in, it's the same way in mining. It's exactly the same way in mining. Someone comes in, does the initial exploration work, and then goes out and finds a senior partner or company who will then take the project through construction. And this is typically what happens. The Prime Minister was commenting today that of the many MOUs that the government has signed on many different hydro projects in Guyana, the only one that basically continued to go through was Synergy. They stayed with it, they spent the money, they got a senior partner, Blackstone, and that is why we're sitting here today.
I would just to maybe add some color, because I see these types of things all around the world, and it is very typical that a small person...
Thank you, sir, but this is related to Guyana's issue.
No, I will allow it. No.
I'm just, all I'm trying to add is some context here, which I think is important.
Let me make it clear, please. Both parties here are free to answer questions, as you are free to ask them.
Thank you, Mr. Nascimento.
Right, fine. I know, but I think the main purpose of this meeting is not to satisfy Kaichou News. It is to satisfy everyone who's here. And if there is a contribution that adds information, I will allow it. I will allow it.
You're offending me. This thing is not Kaichou News.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, Glenn. Glenn, you have the right. And we have the right to answer. She has asked the question, it's been answered. Would you continue, please?
Mr. Brassington, did you do a due diligence on Fifth Motilal? Or is it that any job who comes off the road can approach government to do an investment in something?
We'll keep the question to the first part of it. The second part is not a question, it's an accusation. First part. I think it's a fair question. I think it needs to be answered.
As I said, this was handled by the Prime Minister's office. I was not involved, but I am aware that the company, that FIP, did receive international technical assistance in conducting this feasibility study. So I would say that if FIP is capable of attracting international technical assistance to conduct feasibility. And that itself is some evidence of due diligence.
I think you've got as much of an answer as you're going to get on that.
Okay.
Have you have another question?
I'm just going slowly so you could go long. I could ask everything at once if you'd like.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Now we still with FIP here. Now, why was his license continuously renewed? The interim license.
Very simply, progress was being made, but it required both parties to reach agreement in certain matters. Where you can't have a project built if you don't have a buyer for the power. The terms and conditions the GPL required took many years to develop. The project had to reach a point that the parties are willing to work together. That point didn't occur until 7 years ago. And then site came on board 1 year later. So first of all, both parties have to be willing to say, I'm willing to build this project and sell you the power, and the other parties have to be able to say, I'm willing to buy the power on the certain terms. So when you have that agreement in principle, that is when the real detailed work to get the project going starts in earnest. And we've been working, money is being spent, risks are being taken, progress is being made, and so the license extension is just a good fit. You extend it because the party has not abandoned development of the project. The parties are working in good faith to move the project to financial close and to construction. And any other developer who came, who similarly did that, would be given the same terms and conditions. This is the nature of these large projects. And you can't assume that you will build the single largest project in the country's history and you just click your finger and it will happen.
I do want to interject, and with all due respect, I think it's important to add some international context here because we see this across 10, 20 plus different countries at a time. This process that has just been described, and we are totally independent here, so I'm not trying to defend, I'm just trying to give perspective. That approach is exactly what happens in every other country around the world. You can argue about is it the right person or not, but at the end of the day, projects like this get developed because there are people who are willing to spend millions of dollars to try to evaluate a project, and then they often bring people like us in at a later date in time. I fear this debate here today may be more focused on what happened 10 years ago than what has happened under the 6 years with us. The fact of the matter is that the project is where it is because of the site and because of the Blackstone team today. We're going to get this project to a financial close if the country wants it because of our work. So I do fear that we are looking in the rearview mirror quite a bit, but what I can tell you is even in the rearview mirror, from our limited perspective, this is totally consistent what you will see in other functioning democracies around the world.
Yes, Mr. Braston.
Glenn, just a moment, please. Are you going to pursue the same question or you have another?
I have another question.
Please ask.
Just inquiring here. Did FIP Motilal indeed sell his interim license to Site Global? And how much did he make from that? And how much did FIP walk away with for this entire Amaila project, including the road?
I'm tempted to ask you another question, though I'm moderator and I won't. But I'm beginning to wonder how much this is helping us move forward. And I'm sure a lot of people, and I will accept it, but I take the point that was made to my right. Now that's a good question. Fine. So we will answer that. You say that FIP Motilal is walking away with millions of dollars that is factored in to the glide. I will ask them to ask.
And we'll give you the same answer we gave last time you asked this question, which is that nothing was paid to FIP when the license was first transferred. FIP's costs will be recovered on financial close, so you're 100% correct to say it's built into the cost of the project. It's $12 million. We said that last time we were here. It's still the same $12 million.
So you
But
made
that's not accurate to say that FIP is getting $12 million. FIP spent money to bring the project to where it was when we took over. I'm sorry, if the project, may I answer? If the project doesn't go,
Sorry, I'm moving
not
this.
a dollar of your money is spent. Only if you are able to avail yourself, if the project goes, and you save 40% on power, and then you save 70% on power in years 13, and then you save 90% on power after year 20. Only then, if that eventuality comes true, will you have paid $12 million. And I'd argue, the best investment made in a long time.
Glenn, you will address your questions through me. There are a lot of people in this room, Glenn. Give them a chance.
If I
The gentleman in the white shirt.
Good afternoon, sir.
Are you a member of the media?
Yes, Chevy Deputy with you.
Because there are a lot of people here who are not members of the media that are chopping at the bit.
My question is for, or can be for either sides. It's in relation to one. When this project, if this project comes on stream, does GPA have the capacity, or the company, does it have the capacity to run such an operation? And further, does it have the ability to attract, if it does not have the capacity in terms of the personnel, the human resource, and does it have the capacity to attract the human resource in terms of, incentive, financial incentives? After the transfer of the ownership, do we have or will we have the necessary capacities to carry out maintenance on this project, which is relatively new to Guyana?
I think those are both excellent questions. They were answered in the presentation, but I would ask Winston to address them again.
Well, we are buying the power. We're not operating the plant. The power is being delivered right down to supplier at our main distribution point. So, for the most part, we're not operating this project because we're simply taking delivery of the power at supplier. The maintenance is being done by site on Amaila Falls. After 20 years, the second part of your question, when the project comes back to us, that's a pretty long time ahead of us. And I would believe that GPL, whatever its constraints today, will likely face a completely different situation there. Now, the hydro in itself is not that complex to operate, and all of these questions are being looked at as part of the lender due diligence on GPL, on what will happen leading up to the hydro coming online, when the hydro is being operated by Site Global, and after that period.
I think Mr. Brassington also in his presentation did mention a substantial management program financed by the IDB with regard to GPL's efficiencies. Do you have a follow-up? That's it. Over there, the guy chap in the black shirt.
My name is Charles. I think I'm an engineer.
Charles, are you a journalist?
I am. I beg your pardon?
Are you a journalist?
Marcy's an engineer.
I'm trying to get the press on the floor first.
Well, I can use another hat. I'm the Special Projects Director, Media Proprietors Association, and
Are you a reporting journalist?
No, I'm not.
All right, I'll come to you. The question?
Nope.
Apparently not.
Apparently not. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
Over there. I know, they're all cartoons.
Given the increase from 140 to 158, could we get a breakdown of how much, a breakdown of it, because Mr. Bassett mentioned earlier that Guyana's equity would be up from the $100 million, but he didn't say up to what. I'm pretty sure I remember Side Global being 175, but you said 157 now. So could we get an accurate breakdown? Mr. Quebec.
An accurate breakdown of what?
The Guyana's contribution, Guyana's equity, Side Global's equity, China, IDB.
There it is, right in front of you. We'll give you the presentation. I can't comment on last week. Certainly at one point in time, the project cost was $840 million. That was some time ago. This is the current, latest and greatest number. So we'll give you this, you'll have the breakdown and do that.
And excluding the road, because you mentioned that this is a different project from projects around the world. This project has a transmission line and a road, which would come up to about $175 million. Should we take that out? The project is still per megawatt $4 million. The world average is just below that. I'm trying to, if you could give me a better understanding of how that came about. And in doing that, would we be provided with the contract documents so we could find like bill of quantity, what's not more, specifications along those lines?
In front of you here is, and it will also be in the presentation that we give.
No, I was talking if we could get the actual document, contract document with all the specification, bill of quantities, everything.
Sure, I thought there were a couple of questions in there, so I'll skip to that one. We'll ask China. That is in a contract that's between ourselves, the project company, which of course the government as a shareholder that has access to, and China Railway. We can ask them. Certainly it can be made available on a confidential basis to Parliament. I'm not sure whether or not we can make it entirely public.
I nailed it down. This is the turbines I'm going to use. These are the features I'm going to use. I did my hydrology with my head variation and how much power I'm going to produce. I do all of that. I have a price. Come 2 years from now, most time we'll see an increase in those price for that. It will go 5%, and then the developer may have some additional soft costs he may have to be involved in, and those soft costs are down here in the capitalization of the project. But in actual construction, this is what I'm looking at. Those additional costs I'm talking about. And you show two tables. In your contribution, your engineering design 3.3, environmental study 6.9, legal 0.9, financing, and that's the 16 million you're talking about. You broke it down for us. That is separate from these costs, these other tables costs I'm looking at, additional costs with startup, development costs, and other costs. You got an additional cost, and then you have another item called other costs, of 20 million. Those are what concerns me. And then you have development costs. What additional technical stuff are you doing on the project as far as design is concerned? So you look at an additional $100 million in other costs. Then another 26 million on top of that for contingency. I have a construction cost of 527. There's an additional 100 million I'm questioning, that's all.
I'm wondering if it would help if you would be willing to meet and go through this in some detail with the office. Would that be helpful?
It's not possible to answer the question without looking at it. So, yes, I'd be happy to do that.
And we will arrange that before the meeting.
No, but the media will also need to know what is the answer.
We'll give you the answer too.
But, excuse me, I don't want to put the engineers on the spot. I'm an engineer. I work in the United States for 20-something years, and I design plants. I am asking about these costs, that's all.
I'm hearing
I'm
you.
not being offensive.
No,
I'm just
I
asking about
didn't think
it.
you were. We're trying to get you a genuine answer. Sometimes detailed questions like that can only be answered face to face. And we've made an offer to try and address them directly with you.
Thanks, sir.
Right. I said I'd finish with the meeting.
My concern, Mr. President, is how to arrive at $858 million paying for this project. What feasibility was done? What work he did? Due diligence to come up at to accept 860 or whatever you accept inside Global and Blackstone. I have taken into consideration what we have been publishing boldly on other projects around this world. Have you read about and seek other?
Is the question one that's related to comparable projects?
Yes, I want him to answer that question. He's responsible for spending my money on this project. I wouldn't want them.
He hasn't spent it yet.
I think much of the detail is summarized in the presentation, and the numbers have been out there for a while. The changes have been explained. So the movement from the 840 to the 858 slide on the screen explains that change and why. Brian has explained that. So I didn't arrive at the numbers. The numbers, we know certain numbers are fixed and we know certain numbers are changing over time because of changes in foreign currency rates, because you have to continue to pay lawyers or experts to do work, and that is why the costs are changing. In order to better answer this question though, I think very similar to the last question, I think this is something where you have to be looking at all of the pages and say which cost are you referring to explain what it is. Because
Blackstone said Bujagali ended up at 3.9 million per megawatt. Ours, if you do the calculation, it's costing 5. Why are we paying 5?
Okay, we'll answer that question. And I will direct that question to Southfield.
No, sir. No, sir. No, sir.
And then I will direct it back there.
No, sir. Don't do that.
All right, let me
it's a question. All right. Winston Brassington will answer your question.
Let's begin with the construction cost. China Rail, as has been said before, was selected by a competitive tender, and they were the lowest evaluated tender. That's the first point. Secondly, the cost for this project covers not just the cost of building the hydro, but the transmission line and the road. It also contains all of the costs, in addition to the contractor, to take you to startup of commercial operations. So one of the big figures that you have here, for example, is because you're taking 39 months to build, you have interest during construction that has to be capitalized of over $90 million.
Interest?
During construction. That's all part of this. So your cost is made up of what you pay the contractor, all of your financial costs, including interest during construction. So the bottom line is this. It went through a competitive process. The changes that have occurred since then have been investigated and explained. The project scope includes more than simply a hydro. So comparing this to other hydros is comparing apples to oranges. The project costs include more than the construction cost. It includes all of the costs to basically take you to completion and commercial operations, including interest during construction. When you consider that the bottom line for us is, having gone through that and having had transparency on those numbers, which would be investigated by lenders and everybody else, does this project make sense for us? And when we look at whether the project makes sense for us, we're looking at how much we pay now and how much we will save with the project. Right? So, we shouldn't forget that this is not the government money going in here. China Rail is building the project with China Development Bank, IDB, Site Global, they're all putting money here. It's their money that's going in, that's taking the risk. We're not taking that risk. We're looking at the transparency of the process. We're looking at what the benefits are to us.
But you say it's China money, it's global money. Are we guaranteeing these?
No.
No, we've explained that.
No. We explained it at least 4 or 5 times.
Now, let me answer a follow-on question. People have said the project is expensive, we tender it. Well, you can retender any project you want. The problem is this: who will finance it? This is not a government financed project. We're putting a small amount of money. You retender it. Site Global will say, well, thank you, we've spent our 16 million, bye-bye. We have no interest in continuing. The China government bank will say, you know, we were looking and working with you for 5 years to lend you money, and you didn't want to borrow it. We don't think we're going to waste our time. You know, the IDB may say similarly. So when you look at going back out to retender this is a private sector-led project. Who is going to provide the money? Because if the people who are providing the money today walk, because the project is taking far too long to develop, you could get the best price in the world, but if you don't have the money to build it, you have no project.
I think you got the answer, Chris. I've been waiting very patiently for a long time, and I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Everyone knows, perhaps, that when we had a consultation here last Thursday, I received a commitment from representatives of the government of Guyana that they would meet with me to address a number of concerns that I have about several aspects of this project. And until that time, I cannot and will not support the project in its present form. I'm not opposed to hydroelectric power. I'm not opposed to renewable energy. The word transparency has been used on a number of occasions here this afternoon. And I should say, because of that, and I'm still expecting to have that meeting, I'll take the government as its word. I will limit some of the questions that I've intended to ask. But I think we have...
Chris, before you proceed, if I may, I think I am perhaps in an excellent position to respond to the first part, and that is the government's undertaking that they would meet directly with you. And I'm advised that they will do so.
Thank you. In any case, I think we have a serious information deficit, even as we repeat the words about transparency, etc. Now, we've talked about lots of numbers, and I'm going to get down to some numbers because Mr. Brassington's numbers really boggle my mind. There are several documents that we're referring to, very inferentially. I would like to know, for example, whether a shareholders agreement has been concluded between Site Global and the government of Guyana. I would like to know whether a power purchase agreement has been completed between GPL and the hydropower company, and I would like to know whether a final license has been issued. Those would be my leading questions.
Okay, we take them one by one.
But that's one question.
Well, we'll take them all together then. Winston?
We have a draft shareholders agreement, but it has not been executed. We have an initial purchase agreement between GPL and AFHI. However, until that agreement is executed, it's not a final agreement because subject to the results of lender due diligence, there may be amendments to that agreement. We have a draft license, but we have not issued a final license.
That's actually